After the No, How to Handle Rejection Without Letting It Stop You. Written and narrated by MSE Boost. Most people think their biggest failures came from taking risks that didn't work out. They're wrong. The real losses, the ones that compound silently over years, come from risks never taken, conversations never started, and requests never made. This distinction matters more than it might seem at first glance. When you take a shot and miss, you at least get information. You learn something about yourself, about the situation, about what works and what doesn't. But when you avoid the attempt altogether, you get nothing. Worse than nothing, actually. You get a growing certainty that you couldn't have succeeded anyway, a belief that hardens into identity the longer it goes, unchallenged. The rejection you were trying to avoid becomes something far more permanent than any no could ever be. Chapter 1. What playing it safe is costing you. Here's what makes this particularly costly. Avoidance is invisible. Nobody tracks the opportunities you didn't pursue. No record exists of the promotions you didn't ask for, the collaborations you didn't propose, or the ideas you kept to yourself because someone might have shot them down. These non-events leave no trace in your resume, no gap in your timeline, no obvious wound you can point to and say, this is where things went wrong. They simply don't happen. And because they don't happen, you never have to feel the sting of rejection, which sounds like a win until you realize what you've traded away. The requests you're not making. There's a particular kind of holding back that happens before rejection is even a possibility. It's not the moment of hesitation right before you speak up in a meeting. It's the decision, hours or days earlier, not to put your name forward at all. It's not chickening out at the last second before sending an email. It's never drafting the email in the first place. This preemptive retreat happens so early in the process that it barely registers as a choice. It feels more like recognizing reality than avoiding anything. The requests you're not making fall into predictable categories, though the specifics vary from person to person. Some people have no trouble asking for professional opportunities, but freeze when it comes to personal ones. Others can advocate for themselves in relationships, but go silent when money is on the table. The particular flavor of avoidance isn't random. It tends to cluster around whatever area feels most vulnerable, most likely to confirm something you're afraid might be true about yourself. Consider what happens when someone decides not to apply for a position they actually want. The internal logic usually sounds something like this. I'm probably not qualified enough, and even if I were, they've probably already identified an internal candidate. Applying would just be setting myself up for disappointment, and I'd rather not deal with that right now. Each piece of reasoning feels sensible in isolation. Together, they form a perfect excuse to do nothing, an excuse that protects against rejection while guaranteeing that same rejection by default. This pattern extends far beyond job applications. It shows up in business owners who never pitch larger clients because they assume the answer would be no. It appears in professionals who don't ask for raises because the timing never seems quite right. It manifests in creative people who keep their best work private because putting it out there feels too exposing. The common thread isn't a lack of ability or even a lack of confidence in some general sense. It's a highly specific fear that a particular request, made to a particular person or group, would result in a no that feels unbearable. The mathematics of this avoidance are brutal when you think them through. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. Not sometimes no, not probably no, but definitively, unchangeably no. Every request not made has a 0% chance of success. Meanwhile, even the requests that feel hopeless, the long shots, the stretches, they'll never say yes to this, asks, carry some probability greater than 0. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 1%. But 1% is infinitely more than 0%, and over time, across dozens or hundreds of unmade requests, that difference compounds into a fundamentally different life trajectory. This isn't motivational math designed to pump you up. It's just arithmetic. If someone makes 10 requests per year that have a 20% success rate, they'll average 2 wins annually. If someone else avoids those same requests entirely, they'll average 0. After 5 years, the first person has accumulated roughly 10 wins. The second person has accumulated nothing except a growing body of evidence, manufactured by their own inaction, that nothing good was possible anyway. The cruelest part is that avoidance creates its own confirmation. When you don't ask and nothing happens, it feels like proof that asking wouldn't have worked. See? Nothing changed, so clearly there was no opportunity there. But nothing changed specifically because you didn't ask. The lack of change isn't evidence about the world. It's evidence about your behavior. This feedback loop can run for years, even decades, with each non-attempt strengthening the belief that attempts are futile. Breaking out of this requires recognizing avoidance for what it is, a choice with consequences. Not asking is itself a form of asking for nothing. Staying silent is itself a form of communication. Holding back is itself a form of action, just action that guarantees a particular outcome. Once you see non-requests as active decisions rather than neutral non-events, their cost becomes harder to ignore. Core, the invisible ceiling. When someone avoids rejection long enough, something strange happens to their sense of what's possible. Limitations that began as self-protective choices start to feel like fixed features of reality. The boundary between, I'm choosing not to pursue this, and this isn't available to me, gets blurry, then disappears entirely. This invisible ceiling is constructed gradually, one avoided risk at a time. Each time you decide not to ask, not to apply, not to reach out, you're making a small deposit into a mental account that tracks what's realistic for someone like you. After enough deposits, that account starts determining what options even register as options. Opportunities that once seemed like long shots begin to seem like fantasies. Possibilities that once felt scary become possibilities that don't feel like possibilities at all. The shift is subtle enough that most people don't notice it happening. They experience their shrinking ambitions as growing wisdom. They call it being practical, or knowing my limits, or not wasting energy on things that won't pan out. And because nobody can prove them wrong, because there's no way to measure an opportunity never pursued, these explanations go unchallenged. The ceiling lowers another inch, and life continues within ever-narrowing parameters. What makes this ceiling particularly difficult to detect is that it doesn't feel like a ceiling. It feels like the floor, the baseline of what's normal and expected for someone in your position. Other people might have access to certain opportunities, certain relationships, certain outcomes, but those are for other people. You've simply accepted reality as it is. Accept reality as it is includes countless people with similar starting points who pursued different things and got different results. The reality you've accepted is actually a construction, built from accumulated avoidance, that you've mistaken for objective truth. There's a specific way this shows up in everyday thinking. Someone under an invisible ceiling doesn't just decline to pursue certain opportunities. They stop generating those opportunities as ideas in the first place. Their imagination contracts to match their behavior. They don't spend time considering what would happen if they reached out to someone impressive, because that category of action has been pruned from their mental possibility space. They don't daydream about bigger versions of their career or creative life, because the ceiling has set the maximum height of their daydreams. This contraction often gets mislabeled as contentment. There's a surface similarity between someone who has examined various options and chosen their current path, and someone who has avoided examining options that might involve rejection. Both people might describe themselves as satisfied with where they are. Both might claim they've figured out what matters to them. But one arrived at contentment through active choosing, while the other arrived through systematic avoiding. The feeling might be similar. The underlying stability is not. Contentment built on avoidance tends to be brittle. It requires constant maintenance, constant steering away from thoughts and conversations that might crack the foundation. Someone genuinely at peace with their choices can encounter stories of people who pursued bigger things without feeling threatened. Someone whose peace is really just rationalized avoidance often feels a flicker of something, envy, irritation, defensiveness, when confronted with paths not taken. That flicker is the ceiling making itself briefly visible, and it's usually pushed back out of awareness as quickly as possible. The invisible ceiling also explains why some people seem stuck, despite having no obvious obstacles. They have the skills, the resources, the basic circumstances that should allow for movement. Yet they remain in place year after year, as if held there by some force they can't name. The force is the ceiling, a limit they've constructed through chronic avoidance that now feels as solid and immovable as any external barrier. Telling such a person to just go for it misunderstands the problem. They're not standing at the edge of a cliff deciding whether to jump. They're in a room where the ceiling has lowered so gradually that they forgot they ever wanted to go higher. Recognizing an invisible ceiling is the necessary precondition for raising it. This doesn't mean you have to suddenly pursue everything you've been avoiding. It means acknowledging that the limits you've been treating as given are actually chosen, and that chosen limits can be unchosen. The ceiling isn't a feature of the world. It's a feature of your accumulated decisions about the world, and decisions can be made differently going forward. What changes when you learn to hear no? Something fundamental shifts when rejection loses its power to stop you, not when rejection stops hurting. That's a different thing, and probably impossible anyway. The shift happens when you can hear no, feel whatever you're going to feel about it, and then continue taking action anyway. When that becomes possible, a set of doors that were effectively locked swing open. The most immediate change is mathematical. If you can tolerate rejection, you can make more requests. More requests mean more opportunities for yes. This isn't complicated or profound. It's just a numbers game that you were previously unable to play. Someone willing to ask 10 times will, on average, accumulate more acceptances than someone who only asks once or twice before retreating. The willingness to hear no functions as a multiplier on effort. Every unit of ambition becomes more effective when you're not filtering out high rejection probability options before you even try. But the change goes beyond simple math. When you can handle rejection, you also become willing to ask for bigger things. Requests carry an inverse relationship between size and certainty. The larger the ask, the less guaranteed the outcome. Someone who can't tolerate rejection tends to shrink their requests to minimize the risk of no, which means they're systematically excluding their most ambitious possibilities. Learning to hear rejection flips this dynamic. Suddenly, the ceiling on request size is set by what you actually want rather than what you're confident you can get. There's also a quality of relationship change that happens when you become okay with rejection. People who fear no tend to be strategic and indirect in their communication. They hint rather than ask. They position rather than state. They test waters and read rooms and try to ensure acceptance before making themselves vulnerable. This approach might reduce rejection frequency, but it also reduces connection depth. Relationships built on careful positioning tend to remain at arm's length. When you can be direct, when you can ask clearly for what you want and accept whatever answer comes, your relationships gain a dimension they can't have otherwise. Consider what it would mean for your professional life if rejection simply didn't stop you. Not that you'd become oblivious or aggressive, but that a no would register as information rather than as a wound. You could pitch ideas knowing that most would be declined, because the few that got accepted would make the attempts worthwhile. You could negotiate harder, knowing that the other party's resistance isn't a personal indictment. You could advocate for yourself in ways that currently feel too dangerous, because the danger would have been correctly recognized as uncomfortable rather than catastrophic. The same principle extends to creative work, to personal projects, to any domain where you're putting something forward for evaluation. Fear of rejection makes people hide their best work, soften their strongest opinions, and sand down the edges that make them distinctive. It produces a bland, safe version of whatever you might have been. Learning to hear no allows the unsanded version to come forward, the version with edges that might get rejected but also might resonate powerfully with the right audience. This book is about making that shift possible. Not through affirmations or mindset tricks, but through developing an actual skill, the skill of processing rejection efficiently so that you can get back to action faster. The chapters that follow will give you specific tools for handling the moment of no, separating what happened from what it means, and returning to the arena after you've been knocked out of it. None of this will make rejection pleasant. All of it will make rejection survivable in a way that changes what you're willing to attempt. The gap between who you are now and who you could become isn't a gap of talent or resources or luck. For most people, it's a gap of willingness to hear no enough times to accumulate the yes responses that actually matter. Closing that gap requires learning to process rejection rather than just endure it, to recover from no faster than you currently do, and to treat each attempt as one data point in a longer game rather than as a referendum on your worth. What follows is a practical manual for doing exactly that. No inspirational stories about famous people who faced rejection and succeeded. No vague advice to believe in yourself or stay positive. Just concrete techniques for handling the specific psychological challenges that rejection creates, and for returning to action before your momentum disappears. The cost of playing it safe has already been high enough. The rest of this book is about stopping payment. Chapter 2. Processing the no. Without falling apart. Rejection doesn't damage people in the moment it happens. The damage comes in the minutes and hours afterward, when the mind takes a single no and transforms it into something much larger and more destructive. This distinction is worth sitting with because it changes everything about how you approach getting rejected. The no itself, the actual words spoken, the email received, the application denied, lasts only seconds. But the processing of that no can last for days, weeks, or in some cases, years. The spiral of thoughts that follows, the story you construct about what it means, the way you replay the moment searching for what you should have done differently. This is where rejection does its real work, and this is also where you have the most control if you know what to do. What follows in this chapter is a practical system for handling rejection as it happens, not before, when you're trying to psych yourself up, not months later, when you've gained perspective. Right there in real time, when the no is fresh and your brain is doing everything it can to make things worse. These techniques aren't complicated, but they do require deliberate application. The goal isn't to become some emotionless machine who doesn't feel rejected. That's neither possible nor desirable. The goal is to feel what you're going to feel without letting it snowball into something that keeps you stuck. The first 10 minutes. Something happens in your body and mind during the immediate aftermath of rejection that, if not interrupted, sets off a chain reaction leading nowhere good. Understanding this window and knowing exactly what to do inside of it can mean the difference between recovering in hours versus recovering in weeks. The initial moments after hearing no trigger a genuine physiological response. Your heart rate increases. Stress hormones flood your system. Blood flow shifts away from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, and toward more primitive regions associated with threat detection. This isn't weakness or oversensitivity. It's biology. Human beings evolved in social environments where rejection from the group could mean death, and your nervous system hasn't fully updated to account for the fact that a declined business proposal isn't actually life-threatening. Because this response is physical, the initial intervention needs to be physical too. Trying to think your way out of the post-rejection spiral rarely works when your thinking apparatus has been temporarily compromised. You need to calm the body before you can trust the mind. The simplest and most effective physical intervention is controlled breathing. Not just take a deep breath. That advice is too vague to be useful when you're flooded with adrenaline. Specific parameters matter here. Breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 4. Breathe out through your mouth for a count of 6. The exhale being longer than the inhale is what activates the parasympathetic nervous system and begins to counteract the stress response. Do this 3 times, minimum. 5 times is better. Physical movement helps too, and it doesn't need to be dramatic. If you're in a situation where you can take a walk, take a walk. Even 5 minutes of movement helps process the stress hormones now circulating in your bloodstream. If you can't leave, if you're in a meeting or on a call or somewhere that walking away would be inappropriate, there are smaller options. Press your feet firmly into the floor. Squeeze and release your hands under the table. These micro movements give your body somewhere to put the activation energy that rejection creates. What you say to yourself during this window matters enormously, which is why you need to have it prepared in advance. Trying to generate useful self-talk while in the grip of a stress response is like trying to write a grocery list during an earthquake. It doesn't work. You need preloaded phrases that you can deploy without having to think them up on the spot. The most useful phrases during the first 10 minutes are short and factual. This is uncomfortable, and I can handle uncomfortable. My nervous system is doing its job. This will pass. The feeling is real. The catastrophe is not. Notice that none of these phrases deny the difficulty of the moment. Toxic positivity, telling yourself that rejection is no big deal, that you don't care, that it doesn't hurt, backfires almost immediately. Your brain knows when you're lying to it. The phrases that work acknowledge the difficulty while asserting your capacity to withstand it. Avoid analysis during this window. The temptation will be strong to immediately dissect what happened, what you could have done differently, what the rejection means about your prospects. Resist this. Your capacity for accurate analysis is compromised when your stress response is elevated. Any conclusions you draw during the first 10 minutes are likely to be distorted, excessively negative, and unhelpful. Give yourself explicit permission to not figure anything out yet. There will be time for analysis later, when your brain is back online. The goal of the first 10 minutes isn't to feel better. It's to not make things worse. This is a crucial distinction. Feeling better will happen on its own timeline, and trying to force it usually backfires. But you can control whether the initial pain of rejection gets amplified into something larger and more persistent. Controlled breathing, physical movement, and prepared self-talk create a floor beneath which you don't fall. They don't lift you up immediately. They prevent you from cratering. Separating the facts from the story. Every rejection contains two components, and most people mash them together into a single painful lump. The first component is what actually happened, the literal observable events. The second component is the meaning you assign to what happened, the interpretation, the explanation, the story your mind constructs to make sense of the events. Learning to separate these two components is one of the most powerful skills you can develop for processing rejection efficiently. Here's why this matters. The facts of a rejection are usually manageable. Someone said no. An application was declined. A pitch didn't land. These events, while disappointing, are survivable. But the stories we construct around these facts, I'm not good enough. I'll never succeed. Everyone can see I'm a fraud. This proves I should have never tried, are where the real damage happens. The stories take a discrete, bounded event and transform it into evidence about your fundamental worth, your future prospects, and your place in the world. The tricky part is that the story feels like a fact. When your brain serves up, I'm not good enough in the aftermath of rejection, it doesn't feel like an interpretation. It feels like an obvious conclusion, a truth that was revealed by the rejection. This is how stories gain their power. They masquerade as reality. Pulling facts and stories apart requires deliberate effort, and it helps to write things down. Get a piece of paper or open a notes app and draw a line down the middle. On the left side, write what happened. On the right side, write what I'm telling myself. Then fill in both columns with rigorous honesty. The left column should contain only observable events, things a camera could have recorded, things a neutral third party would agree occurred. The hiring manager said they're moving forward with other candidates. The client didn't respond to my proposal. My article submission was rejected. No interpretation, no inference, no mind reading, just what happened. The right column is where you capture the story your brain is generating. This is where you write the interpretations, the conclusions, the meaning you're assigning. I'm not qualified for jobs at this level. The client probably thought my proposal was stupid. My writing isn't good enough to be published. Get it all out. Don't censor yourself. The goal is to see clearly what your mind is doing with the facts. Once you have both columns filled in, look at them side by side. Notice how much additional content exists in the right column compared to the left. Notice how far the story has traveled from the original facts. A camera could record, "The hiring manager said they're moving forward with other candidates." A camera could not record, "I'm not qualified for jobs at this level." That's an inference you made, not an event that occurred. This doesn't mean your stories are necessarily wrong. Sometimes rejections do reveal genuine areas for improvement. Sometimes a no really is an indication that you need to develop additional skills or change your approach. But you can't determine which stories are accurate and which are distorted when they're all tangled together with the facts. Separating them is the precondition for evaluating them. With the columns in front of you, go through the right side and ask yourself, do the facts actually prove this story? Be a prosecutor. Demand evidence. If the story is, "I'm not good enough," ask yourself what specific evidence from the left column proves that conclusion beyond any doubt. Usually, it doesn't. Usually, the facts are consistent with multiple stories, and your brain simply chose the most painful interpretation among many possible options. This exercise won't make rejection feel good. That's not the point. The point is to contain the damage, to keep a single no from becoming a referendum on your entire worth. When you can see that the story is a story and not a fact, it loses some of its power. It becomes something your mind is doing rather than something that's true. And things your mind does can be examined, questioned, and gradually changed. Feeling it without feeding it. There's a difference between experiencing an emotion and amplifying it. Most people don't know how to do the former without also doing the latter, which is why rejection tends to escalate rather than resolve. Learning to feel disappointment, embarrassment, or frustration without feeding those feelings into something larger is a skill. And like any skill, it can be developed with practice. Emotions, at their most basic, are physical sensations plus a mental label. When you feel rejected, certain things happen in your body. A tightness in the chest, a flush of heat in the face, a sinking sensation in the stomach. Your brain then labels these sensations as rejection, or shame, or failure. The sensations themselves are temporary. They rise, peak, and pass, usually within 90 seconds to a few minutes if left alone. The problem is that we rarely leave them alone. Feeding an emotion means taking actions that intensify and prolong it. Replaying the rejection scene over and over in your mind feeds the emotion. Imagining what the other person must be thinking about you feeds the emotion. Constructing elaborate scenarios about how this rejection proves a pattern of failure that will continue into the future feeds the emotion. Each of these mental activities takes the original feeling and adds fuel to it, preventing it from completing its natural cycle. The alternative isn't suppression. Pushing emotions away, pretending they don't exist, or telling yourself you shouldn't feel what you're feeling doesn't work. Suppressed emotions have a way of returning stronger, often at inconvenient times. The goal is neither to feed the emotion nor to fight it, but to let it be present without elaborating on it. This is harder than it sounds, which is why specific techniques help. Time boxing is particularly useful. Give yourself explicit permission to feel terrible, but put boundaries around it. Set a timer for 15 minutes and allow yourself to sit with the disappointment fully. Don't distract yourself. Don't try to fix it. Don't analyze it. Just feel it. When the timer goes off, get up and do something else. The emotion may not be completely gone, but you've created a container for it rather than letting it spill across your entire day. Physical techniques help too. The body and mind are connected in ways that make physical interventions surprisingly effective for emotional regulation. Cold water on the face activates the dive reflex and can interrupt an escalating emotional spiral. Holding ice cubes in your hands does something similar. It gives your brain a strong physical stimulus to focus on, instead of the recursive thoughts about rejection. These aren't tricks to make you feel better artificially. They're circuit breakers that give your nervous system a chance to reset. Movement remains valuable here, just as it was in the first 10 minutes. But the movement that helps during the feeling phase can be different. During the initial window, the goal was to process stress hormones. During this phase, the goal is to give the emotions somewhere to go. Some people find that high-intensity exercise works well. Running hard, lifting heavy, anything that creates physical exhaustion. Others find gentler movement more effective. Walking, stretching, yoga. Experiment to discover what works for your system. The specific mechanism matters less than the underlying principle. Emotions need to move through you, and movement helps them do that. Sitting still while ruminating keeps the emotion locked in place, cycling and intensifying. Getting your body in motion creates channels for the feeling to travel and eventually dissipate. Writing can serve this function too, not the analytical writing from the previous section. This is different. This is emotional dumping with no structure and no revision. Get a piece of paper and write everything you're feeling, uncensored, unedited, with no concern for whether it makes sense or sounds reasonable. Get the poison out. Many people find it helpful to destroy this writing afterward, crumple it up, tear it into pieces, throw it away. The act of disposal can be part of the release. Talking to another person can help, but with an important caveat. The goal is to express the emotion, not to analyze the rejection or seek validation for your interpretation. "I'm feeling really disappointed right now" is useful. "Can you believe they rejected me? Don't you think I deserve that position?" is feeding. The first is processing emotion. The second is recruiting support for a story that may or may not be accurate and will almost certainly prolong the negative feelings. Choose your support person carefully and let them know in advance that you're not looking for analysis or advice, just someone to hear that you're going through something hard. The debrief decision. Not every rejection deserves analysis. This might seem counterintuitive. Isn't it always useful to learn from what happened? But treating analysis as universally beneficial ignores an important reality. Sometimes analyzing a rejection is just rumination wearing a productive mask. Rumination and analysis feel similar from the inside. Both involve thinking carefully about what happened. Both involve examining your own behavior and the response you received. But they serve opposite functions. Analysis generates useful information that changes future behavior. Rumination generates pain that reinforces avoidance. Knowing which one you're doing, and whether analysis is even appropriate for a given rejection, can save you hours or days of spinning your wheels disguised as learning. The first question to ask is whether this rejection contains learnable information. Many rejections don't. If you ask someone on a date and they said no, there may be nothing to analyze. Their preferences aren't a puzzle you can solve. If you applied for a job and were rejected with no explanation, you have no data to examine. Analyzing nothing leads nowhere good. It just provides your brain with an opportunity to generate increasingly negative interpretations in the absence of actual information. Before committing to analysis, ask yourself, do I have specific, concrete information about what led to this rejection? Not hunches, not assumptions, not mind-reading actual information. If the answer is no, then there's nothing to analyze. The appropriate response to a low-information rejection is to notice it happened, feel whatever feelings arise, and move on to the next attempt. Spending hours examining a rejection that offered no explanation is a form of self-torture disguised as self-improvement. The second question is whether you're in a state to analyze productively. Even when learnable information exists, you're not always equipped to extract it. If you're still activated from the rejection heart rate elevated, thoughts racing, emotions intense, you're not ready for analysis. Anything you conclude in that state will be distorted by the lens of your current feelings. The most useful insights come after some distance has been created, after your nervous system has settled enough to allow for accurate thinking. A useful rule of thumb: wait at least 24 hours before analyzing any rejection that stung significantly. If the rejection was minor and you bounced back quickly, you might be ready for analysis sooner. But for rejections that really landed, the ones that made you question yourself, that kept you up at night, that you couldn't stop thinking about, give it a day at minimum. Let the emotional charge dissipate enough that you can think clearly about what happened. When you are ready to analyze, keep the scope narrow. You're looking for specific, actionable adjustments, not sweeping conclusions about your worth or capabilities. Useful questions include: was there a specific skill gap that this rejection revealed? Did I make a clear error in how I presented myself or my work? Is there something concrete I would do differently next time? These questions generate usable information. Less useful questions include: why don't people appreciate what I have to offer? What's wrong with me that this keeps happening? Will I ever succeed at this? These questions don't generate information, they generate suffering. They're analysis-shaped rumination, and they should be recognized as such and set aside. The output of genuine analysis is a small number of concrete changes. If you can't articulate exactly what you would do differently, you haven't actually learned anything. You've just thought about the rejection a lot. And thinking about rejection without arriving at specific adjustments serves only to prolong the pain. You want to walk away from analysis with 1 or 2 clear modifications to try next time. More than that suggests you're not focused enough. None at all suggests there wasn't learnable information in this particular rejection. Sometimes the right conclusion from analysis is that nothing needs to change. You did the thing correctly, and it didn't work this time. This happens. Success in any domain involves doing good work that gets rejected anyway, because the world is noisy and factors outside your control influence outcomes. If you analyze a rejection and conclude that you wouldn't do anything differently, that's a legitimate outcome. It means this particular no doesn't require any adjustment to your approach. It just requires you to keep going. The ability to process rejection efficiently isn't about becoming numb or pretending that no doesn't affect you. It's about having a toolkit for moving through the experience faster, without the unnecessary suffering that comes from spiraling, catastrophizing, and feeding negative emotions. Controlled breathing and physical movement during the first 10 minutes prevent the stress response from hijacking your thinking. Separating facts from stories contains the damage and reveals how much interpretation you're adding to events. Feeling emotions without feeding them allows the natural cycle of disappointment to complete. And making deliberate decisions about when and how to analyze rejection prevents rumination from masquerading as learning. Each of these skills develops with practice. The first few times you try the fact versus story exercise, it might feel awkward or forced. The first few times you attempt time-boxing your emotions, you might fail to honor the boundary you set. This is normal. You're building new habits, and new habits take repetition before they become automatic. What matters is that you now have specific techniques to apply, which is more than most people ever develop. The next chapter will address what comes after processing, how to get yourself back into action and resume pursuing what you want, even after a rejection that temporarily knocked you down. Chapter 3. Getting back in. Knowing how to process rejection is only half the equation. The other half, the part most people never figure out, is getting yourself back into action before the window closes. There's a window after every rejection during which trying again remains psychologically possible. Miss that window and something changes. The prospect of a second attempt starts to feel heavier, more fraught, more loaded with significance than it should be. Wait too long, and the simple act of sending an email or making a phone call can feel like a monumental undertaking. The rejection has calcified into avoidance, and now you're not just recovering from a no. You're trying to break a pattern of not trying. This is why the transition from processing to action matters so much. Processing rejection efficiently creates an opportunity. It doesn't guarantee you'll use that opportunity. The techniques from the previous chapter buy you time and mental clarity, but they don't automatically translate into forward motion. Something additional is required. A deliberate, conscious decision to re-enter the arena, made at the right time and in the right way. Get this wrong, and all the processing work becomes a sophisticated form of preparation for more avoidance. Get it right, and rejection becomes a temporary pause rather than a stopping point. What follows is a practical guide for making that transition, for moving from "I've handled the rejection" to "I'm back in the game." This includes knowing when you're actually ready versus when you're either rushing or stalling, how to adjust your approach without abandoning your goals, and what to do when you've done all the right things, but still find yourself unable to act. The goal isn't to become rejection-proof. The goal is to become rejection recoverable, someone who can take a hit and get back up repeatedly for as long as it takes. How soon is too soon? The question of timing after rejection is trickier than it appears. Jump back in too quickly, and you risk performing poorly because you haven't fully recovered. Wait too long, and you risk building up the next attempt into something so significant that it becomes harder to execute. Finding the right moment requires honest self-assessment, which isn't easy when your judgment might still be compromised by the sting of no. There are two failure modes here, and most people default to one or the other based on their temperament. Some people rush back in immediately, treating quick action as proof that the rejection didn't affect them. Others wait indefinitely, convincing themselves they need more time, more preparation, more certainty before they can try again. Both patterns lead to poor outcomes. The rusher performs below their capability because they haven't given themselves space to process. The waiter watches opportunities pass while building increasingly elaborate justifications for inaction. Rushing tends to come from ego. There's a voice that says, "I'm not going to let this get to me," or "I'll show them," that drives immediate reattempts. This voice sounds productive. It feels like resilience. But it's often just reactivity dressed up as determination. Action taken from this place tends to be sloppy, aggressive, or desperate in ways that sabotage results. You send the follow-up email before you've thought through what to say differently. You pitch the next client while still vibrating with the frustration of the last rejection. The quality of your effort suffers because you're proving something rather than pursuing something. Waiting, on the other hand, tends to come from fear disguised as wisdom. There's always a reasonable-sounding reason to delay. I should wait until I've had more time to reflect. I need to refine my approach before I put myself out there again. The timing isn't right. Better to hold off until conditions are more favorable. Each justification sounds prudent in isolation. Strung together over weeks or months, they form a pattern of avoidance that becomes harder to break with each passing day. So how do you know when you're actually ready? There are specific indicators worth checking, and checking them honestly. The first indicator is physical. Can you think about making the attempt without experiencing significant physiological activation? Not no activation. That would be impossible and unnecessary. But if imagining the next attempt makes your heart race, your palms sweat, or your stomach clench with the same intensity as the original rejection, you probably need more time. Your nervous system is still too activated to allow for clear thinking and skillful execution. The second indicator is cognitive. Can you describe what happened in the rejection without telling a catastrophic story about it? If you're still fused with narratives like, "I'm not good enough," or "This proves I'll never succeed," the processing work from the previous chapter isn't complete. Go back to the fact versus story exercise. Get clearer on what actually happened versus what you're telling yourself. Attempting action from inside a catastrophic story almost always produces catastrophic results. The third indicator is motivational. Why do you want to try again? If the honest answer is to prove the rejection was wrong, or to make myself feel better about what happened, you're not ready. Those motivations are about the past, about resolving the discomfort of having been rejected. They put the previous no at the center of your efforts, which gives it far too much power. The motivation that indicates readiness is simpler. You want what you are going after, and you're willing to pursue it regardless of what happened last time. These indicators can be checked through a simple 5-minute exercise. Sit quietly and bring to mind the action you're considering taking, the pitch, the application, the request. Notice what happens in your body. Is there a manageable level of nervousness, or does it feel overwhelming? Notice what thoughts arise. Are they focused on the future opportunity, or are they stuck on the past rejection? Notice your motivation. Does it feel clean and forward-facing, or does it feel tangled up with proving something? Based on what you observe, you'll have a clearer sense of whether you're ready or whether more processing time is needed. If you're not ready, give yourself a specific timeline. I'll check again in 48 hours. This prevents indefinite waiting while also honoring the reality that you need more time. Vague plans to try again when I feel ready tend to stretch into weeks and months because readiness never arrives on its own. Putting a checkpoint on the calendar creates accountability and ensures you revisit the question rather than letting it fade into the background. Adjusting without abandoning. Rejection creates pressure to change something. This pressure is useful when it leads to genuine improvement, but destructive when it leads to abandoning a sound approach simply because that approach didn't work one time. The instinct to adjust after rejection is natural. You tried something, it didn't work, and now your brain wants to try something different. This makes sense in principle, but in practice, people tend to over-adjust, making sweeping changes based on a single data point, throwing out what was working along with what wasn't, and generally treating every no as evidence that a complete overhaul is needed. This over-adjustment does two kinds of damage. First, it prevents you from developing consistency. Any approach to getting what you want, whether it's a job search strategy, a sales method, a creative process, or a way of putting yourself forward, requires repetition to work. You have to do the thing multiple times before you can accurately assess whether it's effective. If you change everything after every rejection, you never get enough data on any particular approach to know if it would have worked with more attempts. You're running a different experiment every time, which means you're never actually running an experiment at all. Second, over-adjustment erodes your sense of self. When every no triggers a fundamental rethink of who you are and how you operate, your identity becomes unstable. You lose track of what you actually think, what you actually want, and what actually characterizes your approach. Instead, you become a reactive system, constantly reshaping yourself based on the most recent response you received. This is exhausting, and it doesn't even work. People can sense when someone lacks a stable center, and it makes them less likely to say yes. The alternative isn't to never adjust. Stubbornly repeating the exact same approach despite consistent rejection is also a failure mode. The goal is calibrated adjustment changes that are proportional to the information you actually have, that address specific identified issues, and that leave the fundamental approach intact. Here's a framework for distinguishing useful adjustments from panic-driven ones. Useful adjustments are specific. They address a particular element that you have reason to believe contributed to the rejection. I'm going to explain my qualifications more clearly in the first paragraph. Is specific. I need to completely redo my application materials. Is not. Useful adjustments are testable. They can be applied to the next attempt in a way that lets you see whether they make a difference. I'll ask for a meeting instead of pitching by email. Is testable. I need to be more impressive. Is not. Useful adjustments are additive more often than they're subtractive. They build on what you're already doing rather than tearing it down. Panic-driven adjustments, by contrast, tend to be vague, sweeping, and identity level. They're responses to the pain of rejection rather than responses to specific information about what went wrong. They often start with, I need to be more, or I should change my whole, or everything about my approach is. If you notice yourself reaching for this kind of language, slow down. You're probably over-adjusting. A useful question to ask before making any adjustment. What specifically did I learn from this rejection that tells me this change is needed? If you can't point to specific information, if you're just guessing that something was wrong, the adjustment is probably premature. You might be right, but you might also be throwing away something that would have worked if given more attempts. Without specific information, the conservative move is to keep your approach largely the same and try again. You can always adjust later if a pattern emerges. The exception is when you receive explicit, specific information about why you were rejected. If someone tells you exactly what was missing from your application, believe them. If a potential client explains precisely why they went with a competitor, that's data worth using. But even here, calibration matters. They said my pricing was too high is useful information about pricing. It's not information about your value, your skills, or your overall strategy. Make the adjustment the information warrants. Don't extrapolate it into a referendum on everything. Sometimes the right adjustment is no adjustment at all. The rejection happened, it didn't reveal any specific areas for improvement, and the appropriate response is to simply try again with the same approach. This can feel unsatisfying. Humans have a bias toward action, and change nothing doesn't scratch that itch. But recognizing when no adjustment is warranted is itself a skill. It prevents the slow drift that happens when you make a small change after every rejection and end up somewhere completely different from where you started without ever consciously choosing to change direction. The multiple attempt mindset. Most people approach opportunities as single shots. They put in the application, make the pitch, send the email, and then wait to see if it worked. If it did, great. If it didn't, they experience the rejection as a conclusion the attempt failed. That possibility is closed. Time to move on to something else. This framing makes rejection unnecessarily devastating. When each attempt is treated as a standalone event with pass-fail results, every no carries the full weight of the opportunity being lost. The stakes feel enormous because the attempt feels singular. No wonder rejection hurts so much under this mental model. It means the thing you wanted is now unavailable. The alternative is to think in terms of campaigns rather than single attempts. A campaign is a planned series of efforts directed toward a goal. Nobody expects every effort in a campaign to succeed. The assumption from the beginning is that some will work and many won't, and the overall outcome depends on cumulative results rather than individual results. When you adopt a campaign mindset, rejection becomes a data point rather than a verdict. That attempt didn't work is still disappointing, but it's not the end of anything. There are more attempts planned. The goal is still active. The rejection is one outcome among many, not a final answer. This reframe isn't just a psychological trick, it changes how you structure your efforts. Campaign thinking encourages you to build a pipeline rather than betting everything on a single opportunity. If you're looking for a job, campaign thinking means having 10 applications active rather than obsessing over one. If you're building a business, it means having multiple potential clients you're pursuing rather than pinning everything on a single deal. If you're trying to get something published, it means simultaneous submissions rather than sequential ones. The numbers behind this matter. If any individual attempt has a 20% chance of success, which is optimistic for many endeavors, then a single attempt has an 80% chance of failure. That's demoralizing. But 5 attempts have only a 33% chance of all failing. 10 attempts have only 11%. 20 attempts have only 1%. The math transforms when you shift from singleton to series. What felt like playing against the odds becomes playing with them. Campaign thinking also changes how you prepare for rejection. If you know from the beginning that most of your attempts won't work, you can process each no faster. There's less shock, less need to make sense of what happened, less time spent questioning whether you should have tried at all. The rejection was expected. It's part of the model. You knew going in that the majority of your efforts wouldn't succeed. So each individual failure is confirmation of a prediction rather than a disappointing surprise. Structuring a campaign means deciding in advance how many attempts you're committing to before you reassess. This removes the decision from the moment of rejection, which is the worst possible time to be deciding whether to continue. You might decide, I'm going to pitch 50 potential clients before I evaluate whether this business model is working. Or, I'm applying to 20 positions before I reconsider my job search strategy. The specific number matters less than having a number at all. It converts an open-ended, emotionally loaded question into a bounded experiment with clear endpoints. The campaign continues until you've completed the planned number of attempts or until you've achieved your goal, whichever comes first. This simple rule prevents both premature quitting and endless striving. You're not stopping because of one rejection or even 5 rejections. You're not continuing indefinitely regardless of results. You're running a defined set of trials and evaluating at the end. There's also a temporal dimension to campaign thinking. Attempts spaced out over time are psychologically easier than attempts bunched together. If you pitch 10 clients in a week and get 10 rejections, the cumulative weight can be crushing. If you pitch 10 clients over 2 months, each rejection has time to dissipate before the next one arrives. Spacing also allows for natural adjustment. You can incorporate learning from earlier attempts into later ones without feeling like you're constantly reacting. The campaign mindset isn't about becoming numb to rejection or pretending you don't care about individual outcomes. It's about placing those outcomes in a larger context that makes them survivable. A single no feels catastrophic when it's the only shot you took. The same no feels manageable when it's attempt 4 of 20 and you're already planning attempt 5. What to do when you're still avoiding? Sometimes you do everything right and still can't make yourself act. You've processed the rejection. You've given yourself appropriate time. You've checked the readiness indicators and know you should be ready. But when the moment comes to pick up the phone, or send the email, or walk into the room, something stops you. The avoidance wins, despite your best efforts. This experience is more common than people admit. There's a gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. A gap that all the insight and preparation in the world can't always close. Recognizing this gap exists and having specific strategies for crossing it is essential for anyone serious about moving past rejection. The first thing to understand is that avoidance after rejection is self-protective behavior that made sense at some point. Your brain learned that putting yourself forward could result in pain, and it developed a mechanism for preventing that pain. Don't put yourself forward. This mechanism isn't rational, it doesn't weigh costs and benefits carefully, but it's powerful. It operates below the level of conscious decision-making, which is why you can decide to take action and still find yourself unable to do it. Fighting this mechanism directly often backfires. Trying to force yourself through avoidance with sheer willpower can work occasionally, but it's exhausting and unsustainable. The mechanism doesn't go away just because you override it once. It comes back, often stronger, because now it has new evidence that putting yourself forward leads to struggle and discomfort. A more effective approach is to work around the mechanism by shrinking the action to a size that doesn't trigger the full avoidance response. The big ask, the pitch, the application, the request carries all the weight of potential rejection. A smaller preliminary action might not. What does this look like in practice? If you're avoiding sending an email, start by drafting it without intending to send it. Just get words on the page. The draft isn't the threatening part, the send button is. You can write a draft safely. Once you have a draft, read it through. Make edits. This is still safe. Then let it sit. Come back to it later. At some point, the gap between having a polished draft and clicking send becomes small enough that you can cross it. If you're avoiding making a phone call, start by looking up the number. Just get the number. You're not calling anyone yet, you're just finding information. Then maybe dial the number, but hang up before it rings. Feel how your body responds to being that close to the action. Then dial again, and this time, let it ring once before hanging up. These micro exposures reduce the charge around the action. Eventually, the difference between letting it ring once and letting it ring until someone answers becomes small enough to bridge. This approach might seem ridiculous. Why would a grown adult need to break down sending an email into tiny sub-steps? Because the avoidance mechanism doesn't respond to logic. It responds to perceived threat levels. By reducing the threat level of each sub-step, you can move toward the action without triggering the full protective response. You're not fighting the mechanism, you're sneaking past it. Accountability helps too, though it needs to be the right kind. Telling someone, "I'm going to send that email today," can provide the external push needed to cross the gap. But the accountability has to be supportive rather than judgmental. If reporting your failure to act would feel shaming or humiliating, it won't work. You'll just hide from your accountability partner the same way you're hiding from the action itself. Find someone who will hold you to your commitment while understanding that this is genuinely hard. That combination of firmness and compassion is rare but powerful. Setting artificial constraints can also break through avoidance. I will send this email before I'm allowed to eat lunch. I won't leave this chair until I've made the call. These constraints feel arbitrary because they are arbitrary, but they work. They convert an open-ended decision space into a bounded situation with clear rules. You're no longer deciding whether to act. You're simply following a rule you set for yourself. This subtle shift can be enough to get the action done. Physical state matters more than most people realize. Avoidance tends to be worse when you're tired, hungry, or depleted. The willpower required to override the protective mechanism isn't available when your resources are low. If you've been consistently unable to act, check whether you're trying to push through avoidance while also sleep-deprived or underfed or overwhelmed by other demands. Sometimes the path to action runs through a nap or a meal rather than through more determination. When rejection becomes something you can process and recover from, rather than something that stops you, your relationship with possibility changes. The number of things you're willing to attempt expands. The speed at which you return to action after a no increases. The accumulated weight of past rejections begins to lift, replaced by evidence that you can handle whatever response you receive. This isn't a permanent transformation that happens all at once. Building rejection tolerance is more like building physical fitness. There are good days and bad days. Progress isn't linear. Maintenance requires ongoing effort. But each successful recovery strengthens the capacity for the next one. Each time you process a no and get back in the game, you're providing your brain with new data that contradicts the old story about rejection being unsurvivable. The cost of playing it safe, which is where this book began, doesn't disappear just because you've learned new skills. There will still be moments when avoidance seems easier, when the prospect of no feels too heavy, when staying silent or staying home seems wiser than putting yourself forward. The difference is that now you have tools. Now you know what to do in the first 10 minutes after rejection. Now you can separate facts from stories. Now you understand the difference between useful adjustment and panic-driven overhaul. Now you know how to think in campaigns. Now you have methods for crossing the gap between intention and action when avoidance threatens to win. What you do with these tools is up to you. Nobody can force you to pursue the things that matter to you in the face of potential rejection. Nobody can make you tolerate the discomfort of putting yourself forward when withdrawal would be easier. These choices remain yours, just as they've always been. The only thing that's changed is that the choice is now clearer. You know what you're giving up when you play it safe. You know what becomes possible when you don't. The no you feared has been demystified, stripped of some of its power, revealed as survivable, transformed from an ending into a pause. That pause is over now. Whatever you've been avoiding, whatever request you've been holding back, whatever risk you've been unwilling to take the path forward is waiting. The tools are in your hands. The only question left is whether you'll use them.